You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. Today I'm presenting a talk that Simon von Saarloos and I did kind of as a follow-up to our last talk together at the New York City Art Bookfair, this time called Living with Trans Despair. I'm going to give you the origin and details of the event before I present the edited recording of the event itself, so this is a bit of a long introduction. The idea to make a sequel to our conversation came in the initial planning of our first talk about Simon's book, Against Ageism, as we discovered we were both in the process of writing our own books dealing with despair. The circumstances of the event were particularly special. A friend of ours, an amazing artist, Phoebus Osborne, had a show up at the gallery parent company, a 4-channel video installation called Oh It's My Ass, It's My Anus. Phoebus welcomed our talk into part of the series of events he was holding surrounding this exhibition. But to make the talk even more special, we framed it with poetry readings from 2 beautiful poets, Sahar Khraibani and Teich, whose contributions provided a perfect bookend for our talk, which is also then surrounded by the intensely beautiful environment created by Phoebus's installation. To give a better sense of this exhibition, I'll provide a little description from Phoebus. Phoebus Osborne is an artist based in Queens, New York. His practice engages material traces of nonlinear relationships through a matrix of film, sculpture, performance, drawing, writing, and sound. Extending from his lived experience with chronic pain, he contemplates the accelerating illnesses of the planet at large and considers how modes of relationship can empower resilience and enable repair. His works have been presented within the US and Europe, including commission works at Transmediale Berlin, La Caldera Barcelona, SF MoMA, Oakland Museum of California, Lenfest Center for the Arts, and the Poetry Project. The exhibition is comprised of an immersive multi-channel video installation that explores underground, interior environments as sites of resistance, intimacy, and imagination, weaving together footage of limestone caves, cemeteries, bathroom DJ sets, queer beaches, and domestic spaces. The work creates a sensorial field. Within the gallery, sound reverberates and screens and projectors glow, creating a space for reverie for the viewer. The installation insists on interiority, not as a form of withdrawal, but as a radiant space of gathering and potential. It really was a beautiful experience to be placed into the atmosphere that Phoebus created, and it's too bad that we can't present the actual experience of that through the podcast, but I recommend checking out his work, and hopefully there will be some documentation of it available soon. On to the talk. The text we wrote to open the talk with was this. The liberal bumper sticker reads, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." We could equally substitute despair for outrage. Things only seem to get worse, especially for trans people, pregnant people, undocumented people, poor people, racialized people. The list goes on. Whereas outrage is supposed to spur you to canvass and vote, despair is seen as an obstacle to the traditional possibilities of transformation. Taking instead a radical approach to despair, writers Simon von Saarloos and Shuli Branson are working on respective projects that integrate queer nihilism with the openness of transition, delinking hope and change to operate in the shadows of a progressive rainbow that demands assimilation, rationality, and maturity. This discussion will engage the meeting point between Simon's forthcoming book, Trans Despair, with AK Press, and Shuli's Antidote to Despair, Pluto Press, through a look at the creative counterworlds of trans life. Simon and I have found that we have very generative collaborations and conversations, so I hope you find this talk engaging too. It goes into many different places, following the train of our thoughts bouncing off one another. Of course, it doesn't have a resolution, but opens on to more questions. I've included our responses to audience questions at the end of the talk, but left out the questions themselves to maintain privacy. If you want to access more of my work, as well as the work of the wonderful Carla Joy Bergman, Danny Burleson, and Vicky Osterweil, you can sign up for our newsletter at cawshinythings.com. If you subscribe, you will also get access to all of our articles, our Discord server where we have discussion, movie nights, writing workshops, and book clubs, and more. Our podcast, advice column, and zine and sticker library are always free. I'm proud of the thing we're building together, creating a support system for the lonely and often impoverished work of writing, and also finding new ways to engage with new people committed to collective thinking and writing. If you're interested, I'll be leading a book club meeting to discuss Avgi Sakatopoulou and Anne Pellegrini's Gender Without Identity on Wednesday, January 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're invited to subscribe and join, regardless of whether you've read the book. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, which pulls together a wide variety of shows taking an anarchist perspective on culture, politics, actions, and more. Check it out at channelzeronetwork.com. Now I'm going to present the talk. Oof.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Parent Company. I just want to start by saying thank you to Ada Potter, who runs Parent Company, who's an amazing artist, runs this incredible gallery. For those of you who might not know me, which maybe are some of you, my name's Phoebus Osborne, and I'm the artist that's currently exhibiting work in this. There's usually a 4-channel video installation that we have off right now for the top. And at the end of the night, I'll turn it back on if anyone wants to linger around. It's also until January 10th, so feel free to come back. I want to start out by reading a land acknowledgement that I wrote. I want to begin our evening by noticing our bodies gathered together here in this warm underground space on an island that is the traditional homeland of the Lenape peoples. Manhattan, also known as Manhattan, has long been a place of gathering. I'm grateful to this land itself and to the Lenape people who have cared for it across generations and into this moment. I acknowledge the ongoing histories of displacement and harm experienced by Indigenous communities and the continued exploitation of communities of color whose labor, culture, and presence have shaped this place. So with that awareness, I offer a commitment to learning more deeply about these histories and their present-day realities, and to cultivating relationships grounded in respect and justice. In that same spirit, I also want to share my solidarity with the Palestinian people. I recognize their profound suffering that they're enduring under ongoing military occupation and genocide. I want to recognize the role that U.S. political, financial, and military support plays in sustaining this murderous system of oppression. Folding these realities alongside our local commitments reminds us that the struggles for liberation are interconnected and that our responsibilities extend beyond any singular geography. May this gathering strengthen our capacity for truth-telling, solidarity, and collective care. Tonight, we have an exceptional blessing of gathering together 4 incredible friends in my life, each of whom rigorously and passionately participate in the realms of thinking, making, and living with that play out in the peripheries of social conventions. The liberal bumper sticker reads, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." We could equally substitute despair for outrage. Things only seem to get worse, especially for trans people, pregnant people, undocumented people, poor people, racialized people. The list goes on. Where outrage is supposed to spur you to canvass and vote, despair is seen as an obstacle to the traditional possibilities of transformation. Taking instead a radical approach to despair, writers Simone van Saarloos and Shuli Branson are working on their respective projects that integrate queer nihilism with the openness of transition, delinking hope and change to operate in the shadows of a progressive rainbow that demands assimilation, rationality, and maturity. This discussion will engage the meeting point between Simon's forthcoming book, Trans Despair, and Shuli's Antidote to Despair, through a look at the creative counterworlds of trans life. To commence the evening, Sahar Khraibani will share a reading with us, which will be followed by an exciting conversation between Shuli and Simon, both of whom are in the depths of contemplating trans despair. And then we will close out the evening with a reading by Rebecca Teich. I'm going to read their bios and then I'll leave y'all to it. Sahar Khraibani is a writer and artist whose work has been presented with Montez Press, the Brooklyn Rail, the Poetry Foundation, and the Poetry Project, among others. Sahar is a recipient of Creative Capital Arts Writers Grant, a fellowship at the Poetry Project, a McDowell Fellowship, a 2024 residency at Mass MoCA, and is an alumni of the Whitney Independent Study Program. Sahar teaches at Pratt Institute and is the author of Anatomy of a Refusal and 1,000 ghosts in this feast. Shuli Branson is a queer trans anarchist writer, translator, community organizer, and teacher. She is the author of Practical Anarchism, A Guide for Daily Life. Shuli has translated and edited multiple books and hosts the podcast The Breakup Theory. Recently, Shuli helps start writer-worker collective CAW, C-A-W, and you can find their work at cawshinythings.com. Shuli's currently working on a new book, You Call That Living? An Antidote to Trans Despair, for Pluto Press. Simon van Saarloos is the author of Against Ageism, A Queer Manifesto, Take 'Em Down, Scattered Monuments and Queer Forgetting, and Playing Monogamy, as well as several books in Dutch. Their writing has appeared in co-edited volumes in academic journals, and they also write fiction and theater. They are currently writing a new book for AK Press titled Trans Despair, Staying Unrelated and Insecure. Van Saarloos also works as an independent curator of public programming and artistic collaborations. Rebecca Teich is a writer, curator, and PhD student in English at the CUNY Graduate Center. Teich is a recipient of the 2023 Graduate Student Paper Award from the GLAGS and is 2023 and 2024 Archival Research Fellow through the Lost and Found Archival Research Grant. Teich's writing has been featured in the Kitchen Magazine, Peach Magazine's Invitation to Form, Epic Mix, Bomb Magazine, and the LA Review of Books, Poetry Project newsletter, and elsewhere. Teich's first chapbook, Caffeine Chronicles, was published by Portable Press at Yo-Yo Labs in their collaborative pamphlet, Sharing Discernments, co-written with Kimberly Lidio, and was published by 1080 Press in 2025. So that wraps up the bios. Thanks for listening to all of that.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Phoebus, for inviting me. I'm so excited to be reading at this event alongside all these incredible people. And if you haven't seen the 4-channel installation yet, I really, really encourage you to come and spend some time with it. It's a really incredible Piscean journey. So thank you for having me. I'm today reading from some excerpts from Anatomy of a Refusal, and I thought about trans despair and the role of refusal in our lives and how important that is. So this is from the 3rd section, the terms. I would have liked not to have to write this text. I would have liked to erase myself behind a modest flood of words, to drape my carnal body in the sacrosanct neutrality of discourse, to ridicule my desires or arrange them according to an analytical table of pathologies that would have absolved me only to better subjugate me. I needed a text that would tell it like it is, denature it, open it up like a sealed box, bringing it out of the cloister to subject it to the intensity of politics. There's the pre-organized form and the post-organized form, but transcending all bourgeois forms of organization, even the word revolutionary loses all its meaning. What of revolution is different from simply acknowledging the fucked upness of what we can and cannot see, what we choose to see, what is concealed, and what we minimize as we scroll toward different hierarchies and limitations? Quote, the political revolution can only serve to change the form in which hierarchical power is distributed. End quote. Change the content of everyday life as well as its structure. Come to my bedroom so that no political form is allowed to impose itself. In my dreams last night, we attempted a prison break on behalf of others. In the back of G's car, I put my head on your chest, felt it rise and fall in my life, a seed, germ, essence of organization, a way to be that is beyond, extends beyond ownership in a way that tells me I want does not equal I own. I want to want without wanting to own, a coming together out of mutual need, out of desire, not bound by necessity alone, desires to desire a pre-organizational form. This is an us against them, a clear positioning pool, a web of solidarity, public and clandestine. The use of aerial drones, the war on the screen, when the gaze is simultaneously directed into the surrounding territory and onto the screen with information, to bear witness, to divide and control, alternative infrastructures, preemptive action by the resistance axis. Quote, losing land is a price Arabs understand, end quote. Traps laid out by recuperation, we orient ourselves around desire, taking fire from a landscape. Deserts expand, tending to the flame, clearing the land. Fire builds, encourages life, encourages unrest, and cities set aflame over and over and over and over. I want to not know what losing land feels like. Fire exclusion, the web of life relegated to the sidelines, suburbs, unwanted lands, not stolen. Fire diverts, combustion engines, wires are the veins of the state. Drones zoom in and out without consent, without their consent. They are the tools, the appendages, the hands, the assemblage of logic reversed. Massive fires, resource extraction, ecological devastation. You can't have colonization without genocide. You cannot have a colonized people without the realm of death expanding. The realm of death expands. Cultural burning, a protracted war on fire, horizon recedes endlessly, dominates everything living, everything resistant. Fire passes through its ancestral root. Risk is measured, it is measurable. The state's suppression of everything burning and uncontrollable. Every flammable edifice of domination returns the fire to the land. Places not suited for permanent habitation, it is a problem of scale. How deep is your capacity? The sonic pulse of a freight train, life eating life, producing heat, light, and regeneration. A systematic quest of desire draws you towards the place where meaning collapses. I spit myself out. Politics, even a queer politics, must always be based on the sacrifice of desire and the service and representation of this or that struggle. The intertwining of the desires of autonomous groups in the process of struggle is exactly what we understand to be an insurrectionary process. The fear, trepidation, concern, and disorientation, necessary because you will no longer be in one location moving forward to another. Instead, will already be part of the movement of things and on the way to this an outlawed social life of nothing. The movement of things can be felt and touched and exists in language and in fantasy. It is flight, it is motion, it is fugitivity itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar.
So Simon and I did a talk in September at the New York Art Bookfair. Simon graciously invited me to do a talk around the most recent book, Against Ageism. And as we were planning that talk, it turned out that we realized we were both writing about despair. And so because we liked talking to each other so much at the book, we're like, well, let's do another talk when someone comes through town. So that was the plan for this. And then it kind of perfectly folded into Phoebus's show and able to kind of surround it with friends and like-minded people. The perfect place to do such a talk among people who probably are also feeling some trans despair. So that was my introduction. And I thought what we would do, both of us, is kind of talk about how we're approaching despair, maybe a little bit about what we're writing, and then we'll kind of dig into a deeper conversation. So if you want
Sure,
to open up.
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you for being here. You all, we, and especially Phoebus also for hosting this and hosting it with so much care and curating it in terms of having Sahar and Rebecca here. Very happy to be here among the, it's my ass, my anus, and in the basement. I think it's the poet Sam Sachs who writes that the word basement has semen in it. And the last time that we were here, we were witnessing a beautiful conversation with Phoebus, and there was a cockroach running. Thank you. Okay, there was another one today. I'm happy to hear that because I kind of missed that this evening. But yeah, that's also a thank you to Parent Company for having us, including the cockroaches. Yeah, so my name is Simon, and as was said in the introduction, I'm currently working on, hopefully, my last edits for a first draft of a book called Trans Despair. And I'm drawing despair from the work of Fumi Okiji, who recently published a book this year called Millie's Bent Elbow. And she's writing about despair in relationship to dialectical thinking. So she's a critical theorist, a Black studies scholar, and the dialectical thinking is, right, this kind of idea of like the thesis, antithesis, bringing the synthesis. Meaning basically, if I say and then you will be like evoked somehow to say like, no, B, and then we keep debating until we get somewhere. This is a way of, I guess, explaining dialectical thinking. And there's a phrase that she uses, and it's called despair triggered transition. And it's not at all about trances, but it is about this dialectical movement. So the way in which the dialectical movement, the transitioning that happens, the constant development, is because there's a kind of dissonance or discomfort or a gap that needs to be bridged. Why does it need to be bridged? Because if two things don't align, then in white Western thinking, there's a despair that comes up. And this is what she calls the despair-triggered transition. And so despair needs to remain alive in order for thinkers to continue to want to resolve the despair. So the despair is a problem, and simultaneously you cannot do without the despair because it's what keeps the transitioning alive. And the transitioning here refers to a kind of developmental thinking and a kind of like forward movement. But when I read her writing about despair-triggered transition, I felt that this phrase beautifully encapsulated white trans attachment to despair. So narratives of despair, the relationship to suicide narratives, the relationship to suffering, the relationship to the wrong body myth. And so I was really relieved in this moment of reading her despair-triggered transition, where I was like, okay, there's something here about an attachment to despair. And Okiji's thinking helped me understand something about why this attachment to despair is, okay, now I'm getting stuck already in words. I was going to say why that is a problem, but then of course I'm doing exactly the dialectical move of saying, okay, so I'm responding to that. But the feeling that attachment to despair keeps something going, keeps a kind of progressive thinking alive, where transitioning needs to be an overcoming of a problem, where the trans person needs to offer a remedy to a societal problem. For example, the non-binary is supposed to save societal gender binary. And this kind of redeeming quality of transness became for me really apparent to this kind of despair-triggered transition that Okiji writes about. So for me, this is where I would say despair comes from. Do you want to say how you approach this?
Yeah. Well, one just jumping off point is that like recently in what I've been writing, I was trying to counter the sort of truism that the only way out is through, which I think is a description of the dialectic, right? That if you have to move through these things to get to a resolution, you have to suffer the trials and then lift yourself up above them, like climbing over. And for me, I'm like, well, I'm more interested in like stepping around, sidestepping. Like, why do we have to deal with these things? The book project, I originally was shopping around last year as a much more nihilistic project, where I was basically trying to make the argument that all of radical politics, including anarchism, is completely contained by liberalism, like a liberal paradigm, and can't see its way out. And no one wanted me to write that book. And I had it all reasoned out that they're like, nah. So they're like, what if you said an antidote to despair? Maybe you could like get some people to read this book. So as I like started thinking, okay, an antidote to despair, that's a kind of interesting way of approaching this. I started defining despair. I mean, it could be a symptom. I think it's sort of a position that's created for us through the spectacle of politics and media, so that it's not wrong, right, to feel despair. The world is shit. All the promises that we might have been made, especially in empire, don't seem to be available. We know that the world itself is collapsing. We have how many years to survive on it? That's not an accident, though. this feeling of despair, in my mind, is created by politics and the representational media to kind of stifle our possibilities and think of what we can do. And so we think we must change what's going on, but then we can't change. There's no avenues that are given to us that actually will affect change, right? It's like you can vote for someone, you can canvass, you can write petitions, but we know none of those work. All of us know that, right? And then we also have recent experiences, especially over the last decade, of insurrections and uprisings that feel really exciting. And then there's that like lag time in between. It's like, what's going on? So I wanted to say that despair, not to resolve despair. I'm really also interested, like you, Simon, in trying to think of a way of not redeeming something negative. There's no redemption here, but despair names something accurately, and yet it can't get at something that we're experiencing and living at the same time. And so while we're caught in despair and we're caught in politics and we're caught in watching Netflix, watching movies about cops and the military and all these things and identifying with individuals who can make change and have families and all these things, like we can't see what actually goes into making life. This is general, like broader than the idea of transition, but my book is basically about kind of shifting that perspective. So it's against the kind of politics. It's against politics. It's not a politics of despair. It's like politics causes despair, and then we don't know what life is. But I feel like transness actually is a really good way of thinking about this. I want to not say transness is an example, and I don't want to make trans people into the revolutionary subject, like you were saying, kind of non-binary, going to destroy gender. But I do think perhaps that trans people have the experience of the dissonance that I'm trying to describe, that there's like a life that we're told we must live, or that's the right life. There's reasonable things to think and do. And there's something else, right? A desire that contravenes that, right? That makes you reject reality and rearrange your body.
Yeah, I think that it really aligns with the kind of questioning or the line of questioning that I have around whether that is possible, the kind of dissonance or the non-alignment or even the unrelated is possible in a trans experience. Because I think this is why I would diagnose as almost like as a white trans experience, is that that the alignment is still somehow the goal, right? Like also the focus on kind of like gaining rights or like having a passport that affirms your gender. And I think for me, a lot of it is around the affirmation and like the desire, the politics towards a kind of affirmation. I really don't try to think through transness as a possibility, but actually the loss of, at least in white trans discourse, the loss of sitting actually with impossibility. And that I have to be careful here that it doesn't sound like it's so this is not in any way against medicalization, for example, right? So it's not to say like, oh, the ideal transness would be to sit with impossibility, and therefore the amazing impossibility would be to have a body that doesn't align the gender that you might desire, right? Which would be a sort of like anti-medicalization argument, which is absolutely not what I'm trying to get to. However, I'm thinking here, just to like bring Okiji once more forward, Fumi Okiji, the way that she's talking about Blackness as the failure to be adequately disturbed. And so the failure to be adequately disturbed refers again to this kind of dissonance. So not being disturbed by dissonance, but is then seen as failure, right? Because it's not seen as a, like instead of wanting to respond to that and wanting to resolve the dissonance is just there. And I'm sort of teetering with like how to have that idea of the failure to be adequately disturbed, how to have that be present for myself as a white body, as a white trans person, while in some ways diagnosing the ways in which the call to be very disturbed as trans people in this current moment pushes us deeper towards the liberal politics that you're referring to.
Yeah, I mean, when I use the term antidote to despair, my idea is to be an antidote to the liberal hand-wringing, right? That like sees a solvable problem or that, empathizes with whatever you're going through. And what I was listening to, I was thinking the narratives that trans people are expected to give, whether to get medical access, right, to hormones or surgery, or to be understood by cis people or whatever, often makes this kind of linear progressive narrative where, things are bad. I was in the wrong body. I realized, I came out, I transitioned, and now things are okay. And yet people know who live in that body post-transition that the experiences pre-transition still remain, right? And so you can be like, I'm a trans woman, and yet I lived life as a boy at some point, right? Like some people want to correct that and regender the experience of childhood, which I think works in certain circumstances, but being seen and treated as a boy is an experience that one has, right? Or a girl, right? And so to me, that's one of the ways of kind of thinking about being disturbed or adequately disturbed. And when you were talking about that in the context of Blackness, I think also of the ways that hierarchies relate to oppressed groups and where people are simultaneously cut off from the possibility of assimilating into the norms and also judged according to those norms, right? So like to put it in the context of transness, you are okay as a trans person to the extent that you reconfirm or understand man or woman. And like the people who have had the most representation within media are, we call them like binary trans people. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but just saying like the New York Times liberal basically is like, I'm okay with trans to the extent that it doesn't disturb my understanding of gender, right? You can use the women's bathroom if I can't clock you, right? Because then it doesn't even matter. It doesn't disturb my experience at all. So this is a trans person being held up to the standards of cis-binary gender and punished to the extent that they can't. And I think ultimately a trans person, no matter how well they're able to blend in or, transition to an approximation of cisness, will always be punished, right? Will never be seen as the same as a kind of born man or woman, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it just also makes me think that the definition of what a trans person is, I mean, so terrible, the fact that there is such a thing, right? But it relies so much on being adequately disturbed because it starts, as you're also saying, like this with this wrong body. And in so many ways, we've passed that discourse, right? And non-binary discourse has done a lot for that. But simultaneously, the idea is still, whether or not you believe in the wrong body, that something is wrong to start with. And like in a medicalized discourse, there's a very clear measure of effectiveness, which is that you're doing bad and then you feel better, supposedly after having received care. And if you don't feel better, then it must have been that you weren't really trans because your suffering and despair wasn't caused by your transness, because in order for your suffering and despair to be related to transness, trans care is supposedly going to help you out with that. But I think there's the medical narrative where it's like the doing bad to doing better pipeline. And the effectiveness of that care is having to be proven right in relationship to the right-wing attacks. Or I would say to attacks. I think we can skip the whole right-wing situation. And I'm trying to, for example, in my book, I'm trying to, instead of writing about TERFs, I'm now trying to write about, transphobic people who are obsessed with trans people. And and I'm trying to get it into a good acronym, which I haven't been... At some point, I thought maybe T-pop, but then it's missing another T, so then it's like T-pop. So I don't really know, but I want it to be an acronym. And I just really want to avoid the TERF, not because it refers to feminism, right? Because I think somebody like Sophie Lewis has shown us that there's, evil feminisms out there. And of course, there's feminisms that are exclusionary, racist, and transphobic. So it's not a protection against feminism, but it is really to highlight the obsession of transphobia with trans people, and vice versa, that there is also a kind of attachment in transness to transphobia. And so for me, this feels really important that it's not just a pointing outward, but also a pointing inward and the circling that happens. So I'm thinking the adequate disturbance goes in some ways for me, I'm also thinking about that as a personal affect, right? Where for me, I feel like I started some medical transition situation because I was really bored being one gender. Yeah. And then now I feel again bored because what transness supposedly is feels very much attached and tied to particular disturbances that I then have to uphold regarding pronouns, regarding dead names, regarding how I'm supposedly wanting to be affirmed. And I think here, for me, the disturbance of the adequate disturbance comes up, which includes in some ways excavating and relating to the ways in which transphobia also formulates my transness, as opposed to creating a kind of narrative of inseparability or a kind of containing, like where the trans joy or trans euphoria or all of the sort of like words that we use on the positive side, including the idea of trans liberation, would be something that we envision outside of the hate and outside of the pushback. And like maybe there's a mutual obsessing also that happens, which is why I'm sort of like thinking with this transphobic people who are obsessed with trans people. But of course, trans people are also obsessed with transphobia.
Right. Yeah, you like become a single issue person. This is the way that kind of liberal politics tries to divide us into our identities, and that's like what we care about. And it's interesting the way that you're presenting that. It's like kind of this mirror image of the trans person obsessed with the transphobe and the transphobe obsessed with the trans person. Like when they walk past each other on the street, like who fucking cares? But like, you know, I mean, people have written about this, like Jules Gill Peterson, that our understanding of transsexuality was medically defined and to a large extent excludes all kinds of experiences that we might call trans that didn't call themselves trans, didn't have access to the things that we say make someone trans, like hormones or surgery. And also, you know, this idea that when trans politics kind of cohered as a kind of offshoot of gay liberation politics, that there is a loss also, right, in kind of making a trans identity of the variance of different gender performances within gay world, right? It's like you have to be like, are you a femme man? Are you a trans woman? You know, like the Butch Wars, right? Like there's all these borderlines that then have to be fought over. So I'm really interested, like you were saying, in terms of your experience of transition, in this thought that if we could liberate transition from the medical context, which is something that people are working on in various ways. I don't know that surgery is really on the table, but, you know, people get each other hormones, and this has been happening for many years, and people get each other surgeries too, right? In a way that you don't have to prove to anyone that you're trans. And my kind of like fantasy world is, I've written about this before, is like you go to a punk show, and, you know, at the merch table, someone's just got like a vial of estrogen, like it's free. And well, I don't know, maybe I'll fuck around with this for a little bit, right? And like see. And it's not there to solve your problems because it can't, right? It can make you feel better in certain ways, but it's not going to be some kind of like existential cure, right? Andrea Long Chu wrote that like New York Times article about how her new vagina wasn't going to make her feel better. I don't remember the exact title.
Make her happy,
Yeah, make her happy, yeah. Right. It's not like you have this hole and then it gets filled. I like this idea of being able to play around with it, which does speak to this other thing, which I think can be troubling for people in my mind to get through all of this. Now I'm questioning because I said the only way out isn't through. But I think we have to be willing to get rid of and sacrifice all the coordinates that we use to understand ourselves within this paradigm. So like trans is a word that is useful in certain circumstances now, but in a world that I would want to live in, it wouldn't need to be that word, right? And I don't mean that's, I don't think I mean that simply in like some kind of egg-heady theoretical way, but I think like we'd have to rethink how all these things work. And it has like more troubling reverberations with ideas of race, to think of like, what would it be like to be in a world that's not racialized, and yet gay people, like trans people, there's cultures that have been formed through oppression that are positive, right, in the context of violence. C. Riley Snorton writes about this in Black on Both Sides, that building off of Hortense Spiller's idea of the Black person having a kind of ungendered flesh, that Black people could use gender in various ways as means of survival, as well as being gendered as means of violence. And like those two things hand in hand are hard to kind of hold together.
Yeah, which makes me think of the example in C. Riley Snorton's book of William and Ellen Craft, where Ellen Craft uses gender, right, uses the binary gender because she posits herself as a man in order to escape slavery because she's white passing, and her husband, who is not white passing, pretends to be her slave. And they also use like disability, having a lame hand, I think is what he calls it, in order for him to be able to like sign her praise verse, etc. So then you see immediately the trap of like needing to have the category in order for the fugitive, the refusal, to actually exist. Yeah, it's interesting because even already, I don't know how other people feel, but like I already am having like a growing agitation at us for using the word trans so much. And this is something, I think maybe we can talk a little bit. I'm very curious what like antidotes, non-antidotes you're bringing forward or thinking about bringing forward in your book. Because I think for me, a lot of these questions eventually lead me to kind of strategies that I'm trying to do either in writing or in a performative sense. So one of the strategies I'm thinking about has been augmentation or contagion, and like how to apply that also. So one of the strategies around that has been, for example, when doing public programming and in the context of a film program, I asked the audience to sort of augment transness into the space. So if I was invited to curate this like queer trans program, and of course I got a little bit bored, I guess, or agitated with this sort of like containment, right? Of having to make a queer trans program, and like, what does that then mean? And then does that lead to having representational documentary films only? Of course, I didn't want that. But what does it mean? And so I invited the audience to like shout at the film at everything basically trans and queer. Because if we're going to augment it to the point that it doesn't mean anything anymore, then everything you see on screen in that moment is trans and queer. So like, okay, you'll see the sky, or like, let's keep it with the anus, right? You'll see the cave. Okay, trans. Okay, you see a hand, Phoebus's hand, trans. Okay, that appears to be real, but like, but imagine this is all real, right? And so like the film never starts because there's like this disruption of augmentation. And so there's just no point in actually like watching the movie because you're never going to get to watching the movie. And so like, this is something that I'm also tinkering with, I guess, with this trans despair book. I'm thinking with several different kinds of scenes, etc. But one of the things that I'm trying to do is, like I talk about trans. There's no way around it. Trans is everywhere. It's probably the most mentioned word in the book, unfortunately. But despair, I'm delaying. Actually, now we started with like a kind of definition. But in the book, I try to delay the defining of despair through the work of Fumio Kiji, because despair has a particular kind of affect and resonance. Like, okay, we can say like, oh, cockroach, ooh, despair. Like there's a kind of like easiness with which it's in the room without having to define it. And I kind of like, I'm trying to, by like delaying the definition of despair, I'm trying to sort of give, I shouldn't be the holder of being able to give this, right? But like as the author, okay, I'm trying to give despair the kind of like frivolous playfulness space that trans doesn't get to have. Because even though I would want to address trans without talking about trans, I haven't figured out how to do that yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because there's that like transvestigation kind of thing where like everyone, I don't know, I know a lot of people, trans people who are like trying to decide who's trans, who's not. I'm like, oh, that person's definitely an egg. Which I suppose gets at some of the stuff. And then similar to the thing where you watch a film and you're like, trans, and it's not actually saying that at any moment. It's interesting to me to think about the playfulness of despair. I went into some personal thought. So like despair, when you first think about it, you're like, someone tells you, I'm despairing, then your response would be like, well, how do I help this person and get you out of this despair? And this is the way that I relate to most of my emotions, I think, is that like, I need to get rid of them. Like I need to, it's a problem I need to solve. It's like a math problem. There's a solution to it. And one time, acupuncturist told me that I needed to learn to finish my feelings, which to me meant not take every feeling I have as a problem that has a solution, but to sit in it, which I haven't perfected. It's really hard to do. And that was one way of me thinking about that. And like trans trans, the word itself, has this idea of like going from here to here, right? It's like transit, it's like moving, transformation, whatever. There's all these words that we know that trans is like going from one place to another. I'm interested in thinking about the narrative implications too, which I think is what you're talking about too. Because like, if you read a lot of trans literature, which I do, and I've taught classes on it, it's like always circling around how do you tell the trans narrative without telling the trans narrative in the boring fucking way that trans narrative is always told. And there's beautiful indications on this. And yet there's still something at the core that it's like revolving around and just in response to. It's like, I don't want to read this book. So when I'm thinking about despair, I'm not sure if I want to use the word diagnostic, but what I am trying to think about is living in multiple timelines at once. Again, this is me as a wingman. I believe that there are multiple realities and multiple timelines, and that there are ways that we like jump from one timeline to the next. And this is another reason why I want to resist this idea of like the dialectic, that there's like a problem and then a solution, and you like the good thing and then you lift it up and then it goes to the next thing, right? And it's like this onward churning linear progression. So in the kind of more general way that I was thinking about despair, I was like, yes, despair makes sense as a description of this world that we're living in, the way especially that it's fed to us. And it's not fed to us as solution oriented, but it's fed to us as a problem, and a problem that we're kind of complicit in. And yet there's all of this life that happens at the same time. And if you're like serious, right, and reasonable, like realistic, there's ways that your thoughts and experiences are channeled so that you disregard some of the basic minor things that go into living. And I think this is sort of what happens in relation to trans experience when you frame it around trans people opposing transphobic people. But like, if we are only trans when we're meeting the enemy, and this is like a political thing too, right? I think about this very specifically in terms of trying to combat bills or fight legal cases. Like, that's valiant work, but it's also defending a dwindling territory. It's never going to solve the problems. It's just like attrition. It's a war of attrition, right? So there's a way that our like thoughts of what's important and realistic and mature and all these things are channeled that have us ignore or overlook or downplay the other things that are actually what makes life worth living. And I think about this a lot with trans life, also with abortions, that while the state does all its fuckery, people have always been getting transitioned. People have always been getting abortions. Right? It doesn't matter if it's legal or not. People find ways to do this, and they do this through networks and communities and sharing knowledge. A lot of that we don't want to talk about, we can't talk about. And I think that's another important thing, like what's unseen and what's hidden. But I think just even on like a more basic level, that we tend not to think about the importance of just like interactions with each other. Like here in a room with a bunch of people who may or may not be trans, creating a space in which to talk about this, right, that does something for you. It fills you in some way. It probably reflects something. To me, it's reflecting something about the reality that I want to live in. I don't think I have a solution or anything, but like, there's all these people here wanting to think about this, right? And because we don't have a solution, maybe it doesn't matter, but this is the time that we are spending right now. We've chosen to spend this time, and it's not worthless. I don't know if that gets too esoteric.
But no, I want to actually jump into the esoteric with you, because I'm curious how the multiple timelines jumping plays in almost with like what you were saying with the trans person only being trans when meeting the enemy, which still feels very linear, right? Because there has to be an encounter where you sort of like imagine two people encountering one another as if they're not already encountering one another in another timeline. Sorry, I'm jumping with you there. But it also made me think about, and I'm just going to bring it in. I mean, we'll see if it brings anything. But like, it made me think about this play that I wrote about a fetus heaven. So this is also like jumping in on the abortion, where the play was commissioned for 2023, which was supposed to be the 50th year anniversary of Roe versus Wade, which, and the play starts with a character, Freddie, who wakes up from an attempt of suicide. And instead of that succeeding, it turns out that their desire to stop living is actually because they have a memory of having almost been aborted. And having almost been aborted had allowed them, if they had been aborted, they would have been entering the fetus heaven. And so the fetus heaven is a space, a place, a chorus of fetuses where you can only get if you're aborted. And they do not care about abortion rights, right? Because abortions happen, like you say, regardless of rights. And they do not care about humans because why would they? Because they're like unformed fetuses. They do not get pressed into the linearity of human life or gender binaries or even like human language. And the character Freddie feels this kind of memory of the chorus, the fetus heaven, and feels a kind of draw. Anyway, there's a whole musical part or whatever, which I'm not going to enact. Okay. But for me, I think this is again where maybe I'm calling it, you calling it narrative, I'm calling it strategies, right? Like it's a kind of imagine it. So I really wanted to jump with you in the timeline situation, right? Because for me, the reason that the fetus heaven came forward is because I was hoping to find a language where the defensive, argumentative approach to abortion was no longer possible. So the idea of pro versus con, like the kind of like, okay, are we for or against, was completely gone because there's a completely different metaphysical realm where the for or against does not mean anything, which is the fetus heaven realm in this case.
Yeah, I love that idea. I want to read the play. And
it's in that. So
I'll get working.
Yeah. It's okay.
Well, if I was in the fetus heaven, I think there'd be no language. So. Yeah, making an issue for or against is precisely what politics does, right? You take a side, right? You pick your team, and then you're against the other. And that logic, which was the logic behind the liberal attempt to protect abortion or get abortion rights, failed, right? It failed very visibly over many decades. It was failing for decades. People didn't change. Like the mainstream kind of politics didn't care. They just kept doing it. Like, I always think of it, you're like standing underneath an avalanche and you're just like, there's an avalanche coming, right? Oh, I'm going to stop it. Oh, no. Right? Like that's what, to me, like the kind of pro-choice movement is. And I think trans stuff is not taking that lesson at all. Thinking about the narrative aspect, like I think about the early days of COVID and the lockdown. There's both the experience of people being able to transition, right, coming into an experience that, like, because they're freed up from their like normal daily lives and they're living in this like timeless zone, that they could try it. Yeah. And then I think there was also trans people living outside of the world of having to meet people all the time. I mean, like, my gender doesn't even fucking matter to me, right? It's like, it's not a daily thing. I mean, trans people feel this anyway, right? But when you're in this like vacuum of like lockdown, it's like, oh, I don't have to actually deal with this, right? And on a daily basis, I don't have to like think about how I look or like what my clothes look like or whatever. You know, there's like all those little strategies that people have to get down the street, and you don't have to do that. So that to me is, I don't know, I'm not like idealizing COVID or anything, but that opened space is really interesting, both as a possibility of like encountering transition and also to like reflect on transition as something that is not, that doesn't have the same importance that we make it have when we talk about what trans people are as an identity or what trans politics should be. And I don't know, maybe that space is sort of like the fetus heaven where like everyone's maybe trans or not, and it only becomes real when you like go outside the house, right?
It's so funny because I was thinking this, I mean, this is a ridiculous thought, but like when I was reading the last Maggie Nelson book, which is about the mouth and pain and being stuck inside the house with COVID and a kid, in whatever order you want to put that. And she's talking about the loss of magic, like the everyday kind of moments of magic outside with encounters with strangers. I was thinking about this in relationship to like trans people are magic, this sort of like, again, another redemption narrative of like, okay, apparently we have to fulfill some sort of gap here or lack. But I was thinking in relationship to my own interest in sort of navigating space, right? Like, again, like, okay, am I going to relate to, you know, and I think this is a very like trans-masculine experience potentially, right? Because of like the kind of privileges that the masculinity that you, if you are prescribed this masculinity or perceived as masculinity, that it allows you or affords you. But I was thinking about like the fascination that I feel on a daily basis on like how I'm being approached, because I'm just like, really? Like, you're taking this joke? Like, you're, oh, you have no idea, you know, like, and so I'm walking around thinking like, I'm actually a girl. And some people on the internet are telling me that I'm not allowed to tell myself that because as a trans man, I have to own up that I'm actually a man. Anyway, I'm just walking around thinking I'm a girl, but, and laughing, really. You know, and so I was thinking about laughter as this ongoing experience of transness in public space in relationship to this sort of like desire for magic, because I was interested in the ways in which like the pandemic is often read as like, oh, we're like less visible and therefore so many people transition during the pandemic when people were inside, which is also a very particular kind of class of people who were able to be inside.
Very true.
But I was thinking more through it as like, what if it's like a lack of magic, like a desire for magic? And so for me, that brings in like a kind of frivolousness of transness again, which is a frivolousness that I'm really craving, as you can obviously tell, I think. To say like, okay, I was really craving magic in the weird encounters. And so much of the weird encounters have been reduced because so many things are more and more smoothened with the kind of idea of the smooth city that Renee Boer writes about, or like streamlined, and the way in which like the protective measures of COVID have, from a state perspective, have just created another smoothened rhythm in the everyday. And I was thinking like, what if transness is just an individualized way of disrupting the smoothness? And I'm not saying individualized because I think that's good. I think it's actually a problem. So then I had another problem with being trans. Now I'm stuck. Yeah.
To detransition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this thing keeps coming in my head. I think I read it in Hill Malatino's book.
Side Effects?
Yeah, Side Effects. And well, at one point they quote Mackenzie Ward talking about like gender as this kind of gift that is given to you in an encounter. And then Hill writes about the kind of, I don't know if they use the word, like essential aspect of transness is being misgendered, right? Like you can't get to the point where misgendering is like the accident, right? Like to be trans is to be misgendered in some point. And like, I think they tell a story about being at they're an academic department meeting or something. And like someone saw a legal name, but saw this person who looks like a man and like said their dead name, and like this dissonance that happens, and it can always happen. It's always possible. And you had the inverse of that, right? You were talking about with like going around being like, I have an in joke that you all don't know. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, rather, again, to say that this thing that is painful often is a problem. What if it is also a sign of the thing that I'm living through? And again, to me, like, I don't know, the way that I want to go with this is just like creates all these different timelines where you're like living, maybe this is just like subculture, right? You're like living the normie life and then you're living the subculture life at the same time. You're like navigating this world, but you also know another world at the same time. You have like ways to identify people, but you can't completely abjure the dominant world. To me, that is experience of multiple realities and multiple timelines that we all, to a certain extent, imagine have varieties of this. Whether you're like monogamous husband who cheats and has affairs, right? That's like, or a gay man who's married and has gay sex, right? And marries a woman, and has gay sex. Like there's all these various ways that we live multiple lives all at once, right? And transness is like maybe it has become so much in like the crosshairs of how we need to be honest, authentic to a certain self. Yeah. Probably doesn't exist.
And one thing I immediately think about is also like the idea that you can control would lead to a desired outcome as if it is a computation, right? Like, and I think like as somebody who's perceived pretty binary, which never was my goal, it just kind of, this happened when I started tinkering with hormones, right? Like, so there's also this kind of moment, there's a question of control here of like, how much can you control the perception, which is why I'm sort of tending to trans sexy as opposed to transsexual, because I'm thinking a lot through sex as gender experience, right? And so it's like a more phenomenological biological or being with other bodies and how I relate to others and how others relate to me and how that experience creates a feeling of gender. And so transsexy gives me a way to like talk about these sexual experiences as formative for gender and to also break the delinking of gender and sexual orientation, which I don't even understand. I remember learning about this. I remember Gender Studies 101 and like, yes, that makes so much sense. And now I'm like, how did that ever make sense? That gender and sexuality were decoupled and that they would be separate. I don't understand. But I'm also thinking a little bit about what you were saying in relationship to the materialism debate. And I don't really want to go into it because I think there's a way in which trans studies has to save queer studies from its radical promise, which it didn't live up to because, of course, it was encapsulated by the academic industrial complex. Yeah. Like, how can it not be in the US, right? Yeah. And this is the thing with the materialist argument for me. It's like, okay, well, these are the real transsexuals versus the transgenders who are too bougie. And I'm like, oh wait, but this is all coming from a very bougie campus life from those who are tenured, which is, good for them, but also painful because as Julie was saying in the beginning, like we are here together. And I think this has been my experience too, is like, even though I totally understand the critique of trans as an umbrella term, and I also think that there is a lot of need for the differentiation between trans femininity, trans masculinity, because these experiences are lived differently because of misogyny. I also think that the umbrella term does actually function because we're living in infrastructures and material institutions that use these terms. So like here we are. Yeah. I don't know any of you, most of you, I don't know. So like, how did we get here? It was either trans or despair. Make it go together. I was really lucky to be in Brazil recently for whatever. And I was having a conversation with Adriana Medrado and she was asking me like, Simon, how do trans people call themselves in the Netherlands? Do trans women call themselves trans women? So we were like in this translation problem because she meant to say like, we have travesti, which is not the same as a trans woman. If you call yourself a trans woman, it means that you're a normative, binary, assimilated trans woman, right? But because we only had English to speak and because of my lack of Brazilian Portuguese, she was saying like, do trans women call themselves trans women? And we were having this discussion around language. And, I was learning this new, like for me, new word, boiseta, which means boy pussy because it comes from puseta, which means pussy. And I was loving it. And there was a trans guy, a Brazilian trans guy, he was like, I hate that word because it brings my pussy into the space. And I was like, I love that word because it brings my pussy into the space. However, the point here was for me that we were all together in that space under the stupid umbrella of trans. Even if the umbrella doesn't work, and even if conceptually and academically, I could have all kinds of critiques, we are currently dependent on particular flows of infrastructure. And for example, in this case, it was like art funded this space, right? And we were using the word that we were stuck in, which is kind of how we got here too.
I want to say one thing because we neglected really desire and you just brought us to the transsexy, right? And one of the lessons I learned from a trans woman who has, helped me and been inspiring, she says that your desire changes as you transition. You don't know exactly what you're going to want, which sounds similar to like what you experienced, the way that you were describing your experience. And again, it goes back to the way that trans is in relation. It's not this individual thing. And to me, it was a way of understanding myself too, because I'm like, well, I just want to be in my desire to be same sex, whoever I'm desiring, you know what I mean? Like it's got to be gay, right? And so it helps me understand myself and my desires. But like those things shift. And I think it's really important to understand transness as desire, as part of pleasure. And the thing that I think we can learn from a lot of the early gay liberation movements is like the emphasis on pleasure and joy. As not like saving the world, but like fucking worth living for, right? Like, who cares if, whatever you get like a bill passed if like you have a nice orgy while you're planning it. I translated a book by Guy Ockenghem, who is a French gay liberation militant who also wrote what some people think maybe is the first queer theory book called Homosexual Desire. I translated the book he wrote after that, which was basically a collection of his pamphlets and essays from post-May 68 during the beginning of the gay liberation in France. And pretty quickly, within like a year or two, he's like, this sucks. And he's like writing all these negative, like sort of pessimistic things. He's like, if the politics that revolve around coming out about what do we lose? We lose a lot of things. Like, so he starts saying like, if homosexuality loses its criminality, then it loses a whole culture. So I think this initial gay liberation that gained a kind of mainstream political movement, and this is like before gay marriage, but like the original kind of idea, like Harvey Milk is like this, like everyone comes out, then we'll be okay, right? That quickly soured for people, and they're like, this isn't solve the problem. It ends up reasserting things, right? Because you go quickly to the mid 70s where like it's like the gay clone, you know, like he calls them aftershave gays, like just like cologne and mustaches, and right, everyone looks the same. And it's like become really macho and masculine. You lose the trans or the faggy people too, right? Because everyone hates the femmes. So yeah, I think it happened really early on, and I'm kind of personally inspired by Okingen's thinking about that, about like what went wrong in the initial idea. So my idea is gay liberation failed, and so did women's liberation failed. And we can learn some things from that, perhaps. Not to redeem them, though. Yeah, I mean, that's the attitude through which you apprehend the things, right? You're like, oh, like all this stuff that we did, which felt really cool because we were like cruising the General Assembly. Like now everyone's serious and has jobs, and then they're like working for the newspaper, you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, it's like and this, maybe we didn't get to this either, but the idea of like trans negativity, like ideas sort of, I think, that connect to that.
I wanted to bring it back to the rectum as great. I wanted to bring it back to the anus, because there was a question also about oppositional, like the way in which it's kind of oppositional, and it made me. And I'm sorry for the big statements of like queer studies failed. I mean, that's awesome. But I think like I was thinking about the rectum as grave, not that it's like a gay liberationist text necessarily, but that the liberation is in the anti-reproductive, right? So that the liberation is the sort of like not going anywhere. It's not like the negativity which you brought us to, Shuli. And I think for me, despair is not necessarily sided with negativity. It usurps, can you say that? It absorbs and it like encapsulates the possibility of the debate of the optimism and negativity. So this is why I'm so interested in the despair, is that it's not on either side of the debate, which unfortunately a lot of academic debates somehow get stuck in, right? Also with Afrofuturism and Afropessimism, it's this kind of like binaristic situation. And I think with the rectum as grave, there's also the freedom is in the negative. But I think for me, despair encapsulates the possibility of having both the positive and the negative. If we keep thinking that kind of opposition, be present and opposing. And then I'm drawing in Shuli's different timelines, right? Which you were kind of embarrassed to confess, but I think it's amazing to like for those things to actually be materially possible in both at the same time, so that they are not at all exclusive and that they're not mutually excluding each other, but that it is actually possible for those, what we now call two things, but of course they're much more than two things, which Shuli pointed to with these timelines. And so the debate itself is completely unnecessary, which is where I want to be in the anus.
Thank you so much. That was so enlightening. And Phoebus for convening us all under this really generative rubric and the glimmering tidbits of your show that in its full force are just so immense. And I'm so grateful to be here. There are some resonances, unexpected, including theater shouting out and surgery in unconventional spaces. My favorite. So I'm just going to start out. I'm going to bop between two pieces. And this is probably the most explicit thing I've ever written in the realm of trans despair. But it's from this pamphlet called Shared Discernments that I co-wrote with Kimberly Olidio. That was 6 months of audio recordings mushed down and down and down and down in the editing phase. And so this document happened in a very Times Square fashion. So I'll just read this little piece and then I'll go to more poetry-esque stuff. I think about how I write in the spaces of friendship, in conversations across media and through forms of sharing, and how borrowed couches and beds make reading and conversing happen. Forms of intimacy beyond legislative classification and institutional support are nourishing and slippery. They're vessels for artistic collaboration. I think about the interstices and distinctions between friends, lovers, collaborators, comrades. What are practices of friendship that converge with comradeship? These forms of intimacies are precisely what make me write. The linear narrative of settling down and increasing permanence as growing up, in opposition to proliferating temporary homes and roving collectivities, is something I push against. I want to write about the dramas of plurality, not always as difficult, but instead at times as relative ease to what makes our lives difficult. I see the Silicon Valley cis-heteronormative capitalist, arguably eugenicist, instantiations of productivity, expediency, and depersonalized exchangeability in the growing literature that you might call SM normativity or polynormativity. On the one hand, we have Jessica Fern, who wrote in Polysecure how great Polly is because she delivers a talk at a conference and she can have one partner who takes care of her child and another who helps call her afterwards. And then SM is justified only as long as it helps people therapeutically overcome trauma, none of that pervert shit. I'm not interested in practices that tacitly or overtly maintain or stabilize the dominant world order. I'm interested in the inventive and the imaginative, in the real possibilities that emerge from or produce unsettled relations. There's so much fear and anxiety in any form of deviation from normalcy, but what if that means you go on a sidewinding path towards an imaginative possibility that can be made real and then become something else instead? I want to write against theory or self-help books that frame non-monogamy and multiple coincident serious intimacies only as painful, challenging, or only as good as they are productive. I want to write against narratives fixed on some central couple contending with the trauma of opening up. What if a story begins from a point in which the characters already exist within dynamic networks? What if the story centers on friendship and creative or political practices containing sexual, romantic, SM inflections? I've been thinking a lot about the particular forms of liberalism we're seeing at the moment, a homo and trans normativity that sells out decolonization or Palestinian liberation for a chance at admission to a liberal rights-based discourse. Accepting promised legislative breadcrumbs means not allowing Zionism to be a red line, not demanding the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, and not demanding the Palestinian right to return to their land full stop. This not right now deferral is nothing other than the bait-and-switch continuation of genocide, as if each right is distinct, to be spooled out one by one, and certain rights or movements must patiently wait for a mythic later moment. I want to invite wariness of the concessions this world order asks or entices us to make. I feel like both of you just kind of crystallized so many more thoughts that I have about that. I'm so thankful for that. And Sahar's refusal is fueling me every day. Every day. This is a piece called Sentences of Days and Nights. Life is a sentence of days and nights. Life is a sentence of days and nights is a sentence I transcribed to produce this sentence of Alice Neal's, pointed out by Rai, whose presence punctuates that day, many days, many nights, my sentence. The sentence is its impossibility grounded in the period. The sentence is possibility or suspension of disbelief. I mean that in all ways, just as at the same time I'm testing provocation. Come, follow me down that line. On this day, I'm sitting at a table near the window and I breathe with space of stillness. I write out many things to do of varying urgencies, attuned to my shoddy short-term memory and quiet attachment to excess. Replace frame, complete session reports, edit chapter, laundry ? That doesn't happen ever. Do these short lineations call their tasks into being? No, they denote aspiration and more often than not, sheer impossibility. The to-do list is always a lie. Here's how the day will be structured. Here are the objects and orientations of necessary demand. The best one can do is hope, but I'm instead left with an object that is a sentential relic of either completion that bequeaths its eradication or a lingering reminder of the past day's lack and future day's burden. Currently, I'm reading 2 books written approximately 150 years apart that are full of sentences of days and nights, sentence days and nights, felt layered as both firm claim and desirous plea. Here's a sentence from one of those books about days and nights. Even the ideas of day and night, which in the old statutes were peasant simplicity, became so confused that an English judge as late as 1860 needed the penetration of an interpreter of the Talmud to explain judicially what was day and what was night. Here's the sentence that follows. Capital was celebrating its orgies. As someone invested in inversion, I believe the best orgies are the ones that do not celebrate capital. And it also logistically helps if it's at night or captures the ideas of night, not the ideas of day, which has to do with the accumulated significatory ambience of what's contained within the idea of day, and less, if anything at all, about when the sun is out, as some sort of indicator of when people's supposed free time does or does not occur. the convergence of brightness and unorganized toil-free time. This is because the working day is euphemism no longer and never was conscripted to daylight hours, unleashed from the constraints of the broken clock to swallow all that's moment. The working day is also the working night, is also the endless aggregation of moments within the semblance of a sliced-off packaging to produce units of differentiation between machine input and machine output. We can share our Google calendars all we want, but I never do quite know what is the best time when all my friends would be free. A few hours before the last orgy I attended, I was stricken with nerves around the soon-to-be meeting of two of my lovers, and stricken as well with the feeling that contradicted many of the sentences that formed a core premise of a reading group I recently facilitated. Some of these people are in the room. Reading group, rise up. That forms some of the core premises I hope to craft my movements around. Some of the core premises include the ethical potentiality of the crush, which opens us up to new affiliations, kinds of giving that don't demand receiving equivalence in exchange. It concerns itself with the breakdown of old forms and their according limitations, conventions, upholdings, in favor of new forms in the service of the abundance of all those right things and the destruction of all that holds us back from that abundance. To begin and grow from the groundwork of abundance and not fear, to ground oneself in the good faith others begin there as well. A sentence written in my notebook that I kept for the duration of the reading group titled Crush Syllabus reads, "Let us crush more generously." Another reads, "Crushing is a reinterpretation of the everyday." Another, "What kind of fucking will outlive capital?" Sometimes we have to work to become more like our sentences. At best, or at worst, or more likely inevitably, our sentences punctuate each other. We rearranged the mirrors so that we all, and others too, could always be able to see each other from multiple vantage points, and this arrangement, that was also an opening up, I was put to ease. Things enter that you cannot control, but still a pull of the sometimes inevitable, an ethical concern with which you build elements around. As night turned back into day, I took a moment to break pieces of freshly re-dried candle wax off of the futon's lush red feathery cover. The hosts had to take the futon cover to the dry cleaners the next day, so unfortunately I confess I don't think that night's fucking outlived capital. Where love or its action is never looking at each other, but looking off approximately towards the same thing, often unclear, often multiple. Our looking too is multiple, and there's a beauty to that. Every Sunday, or nearly so, sitting in a circle, looking at an object that contains thousands of sentences and learning how others look at objects more generally through the vehicle of this particular one. One voice refrains in asking us to return to the chrysalis, and another takes us to a footnote. One points us to an outside text, and another draws us closer inward. I hold a dry orange peel and catch my breath, fixate on the ghostly outline of contact. The hand outstretched animates the fruit as co-conspirator. A sentence can't make anyone do something, and if that's true, then all sentences are really just questions. A sentence makes us into someone, and if that's true, then I am that sentence, then I am someone. Does a sentence need to be true, or does it need to be effective? Every Sunday, during the point at which day meets night, I write down the things that those around me say they're sentences, and briefly I become them. I don't think that sentences are bricks, but paragraphs are certainly shaped like them. At the end of the day, there are objects beholden to gravity, rent, friction, hunger, and spring. At the end of the day, there's...
I just want to say thank you to everyone for hanging out with us tonight. Thanks to everyone who contributed. Sahar, Becca, Science Street. Thank you so much. So special to have you.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. As always, if you like the show, please rate and follow us wherever you get it, and tell your friends they need to break up.